Welcome to K-Pastors Roundtable. I'm your host, Alex. Today, I'm with Dr. Timothy Lee. He is currently a fellow at UCLA Hospital. Welcome, Dr. Lee.
Thank you.
What is fellow?
Oh, sure. So a fellow is a physician who has finished residency, and in order to get further trained in a particular specialty, will go to a program, a fellowship, to complete a dedicated period of time where they get trained in a specific field. In my case, I am doing a field called clinical informatics. It's a relatively new specialty, and the fellowships usually have a separate boarding. So, for example, I'm boarded in family medicine, but by doing the fellowship, I will be eligible to take the board for this other specialty, in my case, clinical informatics. So it, in short, is further specialization.
So how long is your fellow supposed to last?
My fellowship is a 2-year fellowship.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's one of the shorter fellowships. Fellowships can be anywhere from 1, so sometimes as much as 3-4 years. Not too bad.
Okay. So once you're done with the fellow, then do you go into private practice or do you work for hospital or?
It really depends on the specialty and what particular part of medicine you want to get involved with. There are so many different ways to practice. There's private practice, there's working at a large specialty group, there's academic centers like UCI, UCLA, but in general, the specialty that I'm currently in typically works for a larger organization, such as a large healthcare group like Healthcare Partners or the Memorials or at academic centers. Because my specialty is very particular, it's basically using technology and integrating that into healthcare. So things like the electronic health record, data analytics, mobile applications, things like that. And so only larger institutions usually have a position for that specifically.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Sounds very interesting and wonderful. So anyway, we'll ask more questions about that, but let's go back to where did you grow up?
Growing up, I am from Chicago, Illinois.
Okay.
So I actually grew up there all my life, and I went to undergrad, at graduate school, and medical school in Illinois. So always in the Midwest.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, were you always Christian, or did you become a Christian when you were growing up? Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. So I grew up in Chicago because both my sides of the family are some of the older Korean families in Chicago. My grandfather was a church planter in Chicago, actually.
Oh, okay.
And so they were all Christian. My parents were Christian. Actually, both sides of my family had several pastors in the lineage. And so for me, it was I grew up Christian, and it kind of wasn't a choice. But I think always knowing about God and being around church, growing up in church all my life, it was always in the back of my mind. It wasn't until junior high that I actually became, I would think, an actual Christian, a true believing gospel believing Christian. And that was because when I was in junior high, I was beginning to question a lot of things. I was, getting to that age where I begin to think about things more deeply. And I was also I was beginning to hang out with the wrong kids, I guess you could put it that way. And so my mother actually sent me to a mission trip.
Oh, okay.
Thinking that it would scare me straight or, something like that.
Okay.
But, it actually worked. I went to Mexico for my first time after my 6th grade, I think. And I was only 12 years old when I first went. But I think the perspective shift going from the Chicago suburbs, very comfortable life, to seeing children living in cardboard boxes, and then realizing that they had hope and joy despite their circumstances. As I met the children in the orphanage at the church in Mexico, I think that dichotomy between my life experience versus theirs and the common faith that was shared, I realized that this is something real. That there's more to life than what I thought of and understood. And it was actually on a mission trip the second time, not the first time, unfortunately, the second time where I actually came to faith. When I digested everything I had been seeing and now really starting to believe the things that I had learned all my life as a Christian, there was a moment where I actually began to understand my sin, and I felt like I experienced what true forgiveness meant. And that was probably the moment that I would consider having really come to faith.
How old were you?
That time, I believe I was 13 when that happened. It was my second
Wow.
mission trip. Yeah, I came to faith pretty young.
You must have been a very heavy thinker.
Oh, yes, definitely. To a fault.
Okay.
If anything, I thought too much. Maybe if I didn't think so much, I would have came to faith earlier. Yeah, but yes, I was pretty precocious. I used to think very deeply about the meaning of life and, why do I exist? But yeah, ultimately it came to a point where, you think enough, you know enough. It's about believing.
Which part of Mexico did you go?
Oh, so there is a small immigrant farming community called San Telmo in Baja California.
Oh, okay.
So just a few hours south of the border.
Okay.
It's near Ensenada, just a couple hours south of Tijuana. But at that time, there was nothing really out there.
Right.
It was just farmland, a lot of berry farms, tomato farms, and the community is a lot of transient farmers. So they'll work one season in Oaxaca, one season in near Ensenada, and then another season somewhere else. So it was a rough neighborhood just because people didn't really have a commitment to the area and they were moving all around. But we were with an organization called For Christ Mission, and they for almost 20 years now have been, dedicated to serving that community. And I had the privilege of seeing that from when it was dirt to now become a mission center with a primary school and now a secondary school.
Wow.
And daycare and multiple services, and so it's been really phenomenal and a huge blessing to be able to see that progression. And so that's had a huge impact on my life. I've gone back there almost every summer of my life until just a couple years ago when I was in residency, when I finished medical school. I just haven't had the time, but yeah, pretty much every year I went back.
Now, was there one missionary couple or person that was manning the
Oh yes,
center for 20 years now, or?
yeah. My one of my spiritual fathers, like a mentor for a long time, was Reverend Paul Saw. For Christ Mission was started by him in the late 90s. Him and his wife have been running it faithfully for over 20 years now.
Okay.
And he doesn't live there full time because he is an evangelist at heart and a church and a mission planter. So he's all over the world now. He's Mexico, several places in Mexico, South America, Bolivia, Panama, and then also now into Southeast Asia. So yeah, he goes around and plants churches, raises up local pastors and leaders, sends them to seminary, and then they build a church together, and then he'll do that all over the world. So I've gotten to go with him on several mission trips to all these different countries that I just mentioned. And eventually he'll do a medical mission trip in that area too.
Okay.
And so that's how I ended up getting that medical experience.
Okay. Now, did you have to prepare or get trained to go to these mission trips, or how did you manage?
Well, in the beginning it was very small. The organization itself was very small. And so we just kind of went.
Okay.
But eventually we started to build training programs. After having gone for so long, we then helped other people start to train. So I got trained on the field
Okay.
through experience, and then we started to help other people train with cultural sensitivity, what to expect, getting ready to do like VBS, skate stances, how to teach, preach, things like that.
So if you've been going to the same area for a long time, is there any particular people or person that you know in that area you have become friends with?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. For the most part, in general, the people who live in these areas are very transient, so they move around. So not many, but I mean, several of them who were there for a long time, like Arturo, he's kind of one of the staff members at the church, a close friend. I love him like a brother. Don't get to see him often, except when I go back, but people like him and Chewy, they're people on our hearts who we get to see every year and build that relationship with.
Okay.
And I think I told you this, but my parents actually live in Mexico now too.
Right.
And so, going back a couple times a year, you can sort of maintain a relationship, but my parents actually moved there because they wanted to invest. So I started going on these trips, and then my family started going on these trips together. And instead of vacation, we would do family mission trip. And then my parents loved it so much that when my dad was able to retire, they actually moved to Mexico
Wow.
to do full time.
Wow.
And so now they're there. and they have much more robust and deeper relationships with the community.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Today, I'm with the Dr. Timothy Lee. He is currently a fellow at UCLA Hospital. Now, moving away from the mission trips, you became a doctor. What is that process like? I mean, when did you decide that you're going to go into medical field? And
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. So I've always enjoyed science and learning, and like you've noticed, I question everything. I like to think, and so I think the process to consider being a doctor was a relatively natural step. It really happened when I was on a medical mission trip in high school.
Oh, okay.
I was about 15, I think, or 15 or 16, and I went on a medical mission trip with doctors actually from Torrance around here. And I just remember that after I had come to faith, after living as a Christian for a few years and, beginning to understand what it means to be a Christian, not just to say I'm a Christian, but to live as a Christian, meaning I want to serve people and I want to serve God, right? I wanted a tangible way to do that, to serve both God and people. And it was on a medical mission trip where I was sitting with a couple doctors, Dan Harvey being one of them. I just remember the way that he sat in front of the patient. He was knee to knee with the patient. They were touching almost because they're so close. And he leaned in.
Right.
And he was just so attentive, and so much compassion and care came out from that encounter. And the way that he just ministered to them through that, I remember leaving a big impression on me. And that's when I began to start thinking about maybe being a doctor would be a cool way to live as a Christian. And so I think that was always in the back of my mind. And when I was in probably right before college, I remember being on a mission trip and just and praying to God, like, Lord, what do you want me to do? What would you have of me? And it just happened to be another medical mission trip.
Okay.
And I just remember in that moment, I just felt a very strong call to just serve people, to serve God through mercy ministry. And so going into college, I had a strong inclination that I should probably at least pursue being a doctor.
Okay.
Because if I realized if I have the natural desire and I have been gifted by God with the ability to become a doctor and then feel this strong call, then I felt, well, then I should pursue this. And I think that's generally how I go about figuring out my calling, was to find an internal subjective, do I feel like I want to do this? An external objective, do other people think that I'm gifted enough to do those things? And then a supernatural calling, do I feel like the Lord has called me to do those things? So whenever I make a decision, I usually think of those three things.
Okay.
Yeah.
So obviously, getting into college and starting the path of becoming a doctor, initially is fairly straightforward, college,
Yeah.
4 years.
Right.
And then after that, you had to apply obviously to the medical school. So what was that transition like, applying to medical
Sure.
school, finding it? And,
Yeah. I think my path was not as typical. So I can go over a typical route. A typical route is that you do undergrad 4 years, and then you go into medical school for another 4 years.
Right.
And then you go into residency from anywhere from 3 to 5 years.
Right.
And then you become what we call an attending physician.
Right.
A doctor.
Right.
I finished undergrad in 3 years.
Okay.
Excuse me. And I had a scholarship that I would have gotten a free year of tuition. And at that time, I was at a crossroads because down at Urbana-Champaign, where I went to undergrad, I was serving at my church, and I was very involved. I was a small group leader. I was on the worship team, and I was really toying with the idea of becoming a pastor. So I was finishing undergrad early, and I really wanted to grow in my faith and explore if I was called to full-time ministry or not. I was really enjoying being a leader in the church and serving my community group and being on the worship team. And so for a little while there, I was beginning to doubt my calling as a doctor because I was just enjoying ministry so much.
Oh, okay.
But then I remember going to a winter retreat where I got the chance to meet one of the speakers who was a doctor. And I went up to him after one of the sessions and I asked him, what made the difference? How did you choose between ministry and being a doctor? And I just remember he said something very simple. He said, I thought about being a pastor as well. But when I prayed to God and I asked him, God, Lord, what would be the best way for me to serve your people and to serve you? He said that he just felt like it's such a rare opportunity to leverage being a doctor, a physical, tangible skill with that same heart of a pastor within a doctor to serve people. Mm-hmm. And I just remember in that moment feeling very, very convicted, like a conviction that whatever I do, that I want it to be about serving others and not just what I enjoy. So as much as I enjoyed full-time ministry, what I felt and what I was convinced that would be a better avenue to serve was to become a doctor. But in that meantime, I did have that extra year, so I ended up doing a master's degree in community health because after all of the mission trips I've been on, I realized that, one thing that is lacking on short-term mission trips is continuity and sustainability. Meaning you go on a short-term trip, you give some people medications, you see them, you treat their illness at the time, but then you leave.
Right.
And then what are they going to do? Or the community itself is so poor that they don't have their own providers. Or if you go in as a medical missionary, you go there and then the local doctors look bad because the American doctors are in town. And so I wanted to learn, how do I create change that lasts?
Okay.
How do I teach a man to fish rather than just give him a fish?
Right.
And so through that master's degree, I learned about community development, policy, and organization administration, thinking that maybe one day I could try to do community development. And then after that was another 3 years for that master's degree. I then applied for and got into medical school because I felt the conviction was I could continue this master's into a PhD, but I felt that, okay, now is the time to just go out and start to do something practical, be the doctor. So my medical school was 4 years where I did an extra track in global health. And then I went to family medicine because I wanted to do a specialty that allowed me to understand from birth to death and also get engaged in the community, as well as taking kids and women along with just adult medicine. So that's family medicine. So that was undergrad, graduate school, medical school, residency, and then now this fellowship. This is a relatively new concept and idea. So in my master's degree, I mentioned that I wanted to do things that would create sustainable change, that would empower local communities, that would be long-lasting. When I was going through my global health education and even in residency, I began to think, okay, the whole landscape of healthcare is changing. We are more advanced now than we were ever before. But the limiting factor here is not God, and it's not the information out there. It's our ability as human doctors to properly disseminate all that healthcare knowledge and information and understanding. And so how can we bridge that gap? One thing that I realized was you go on a mission trip or you go to any developing country, under-resourced country, one thing you'll notice is that even in the poorest regions, they could be living in cardboard boxes and have no latrines and they're going to the bathroom next to their hut. But they'll have a smartphone.
Oh, really?
Yes. Yes. They'll have access to internet.
Wow.
They'll have technology just everywhere.
Wow.
And so what I realized was that if I wanted to create a change that would, propel the future, that can bridge the gap between rich and poor, that could create sustainable change, it was to leverage the changes in technology integrated with healthcare and for the gospel. And that's a relatively, I think, novel idea, and I haven't met too many organizations doing this. But I do see that this is the future of healthcare and the future of missions.
Right.
So trying to combine those things, because like I mentioned, I'm interested in, not that I don't think that short-term mission trips are, good or that there is a good that comes out of it, but I'm more interested in changes that create long-lasting development, sustainable, empowering changes. And so that things like education, things like capacity building, things like training. And so my future dream would be to integrate healthcare technology and education into some kind of training for or consulting with other organizations or governments, communities abroad, and then using that as a platform to leverage the gospel.
Wow. I'm so glad you're looking at the longevity of, what you can do either in health or in mission. Today, I'm with the Dr. Timothy Lee. He is currently a fellow at UCLA Hospital. Now, one of the questions that I know you grew up in, Illinois, but what brought you out to LA area or Southern California?
Yeah, sure.
That must have been a big jump from Midwest to West Coast.
Oh, it was a huge jump. The culture is vastly different.
Yes.
I mean, just physically, one season here versus winter and summer there.
Right.
And then there's even the spiritual climate is a little bit different.
Very different. Yeah.
Very different. And even the healthcare culture is different. And so for all of those reasons, I actually wanted to be in California because I had come out to California so often for mission trips.
Right.
The mission organization was based in San Diego.
Okay.
So I'd come almost every summer. And I just loved, went in and out and burritos. But I also loved just the culture here and, how people wanted to be a little more progressive with the changes that we make, both in terms of political and spiritual climate, and feeling like this was a good place to learn. Because family medicine in the West Coast is much stronger than it is in the Midwest or East Coast.
Oh, really? Why is that?
Absolutely. So the culture of medicine in general is very hierarchical. It's very competitive, and for whatever reason, family medicine is not viewed as strongly in the East Coast as opposed to here in the West Coast. Because family medicine, we tend to be more open to new ideas and to be less stringent on hierarchy and power. We're more about the community and people, and so that generally in the West Coast flies a little bit better.
Yeah. Okay. I also, because I know you a little bit, so you recently got married.
I did.
So how is the married life?
Oh, it is amazing. I mean, the thing with my marriage in particular is that my wife and I have actually been friends since we were in high school.
Oh,
we met when we were 14, I believe. So that's 17 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah, and have been friends since then. We actually met each other because, as I mentioned, my grandfather was a church planter. Her mother and family actually went to one of my grandfather's churches in Chicago. And the community back then was very small, the Korean community. And so our parents knew each other.
Oh, okay.
And so when we got older, we reconnected because a lot of us in the Chicago community, the second generation parents, our parents, wanted to do this mission trip together. And so we would have Bible studies weekly and get ready for the mission trip.
Right.
And that's actually how we all got together and met and became friends. So we became close because we went on a mission trip together. And so that's where the magic happened.
Okay. Under the spell of God.
We didn't start dating until last year, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Well, she went to Northwestern, and I went to the University of Illinois. And then she moved out here early, much earlier than I, and I was still in Chicago. So we were always separated by distance, but we always kept up and, would, talk to each other on our birthdays and hang out whenever we were in, either city. And it wasn't until last year that after turning 30, both of us realized, okay, I think it's time that we, became adults and settled down. And basically just it became obvious that God had prepared both of us for each other. And that we complement each other very well in our giftings and our ability and our calling. It went from parallel to being almost one single line that we were going on. Do you know what I mean? We both have a huge heart for, obviously, mercy ministry, justice ministries, but also children, orphans. We both are very passionate about orphan care. I know it seems odd for a doctor to we talk about that a lot, but a dream of both of ours in terms of calling is to somehow get involved in decreasing the amount of orphans and improving orphan care in the future.
Wow.
Yeah, and so that's a particular dream that we both kind of latched on to, and we realized when we were discussing that, this is unique, and it is not a coincidence, we felt, that God had separately led us to the same convictions and conclusions.
Wow.
And so that actually happened all when we were doing a 3-week Daniel fast.
Okay.
So I don't know if we actually saw each other during that time, but I remember there was a period when I was in residency where I just felt like God was calling me to just prepare for graduation, for getting ready to finish being a resident into being a full-time doctor, and leading me into a season of, okay, now get ready for the next season. So I did a 3-week Daniel fast, and my wife, Victoria, she was finishing an internship at church, and she felt like she wanted to do that as well. So we actually did the Daniel fast together.
Oh, wow.
And it was during that fast that, we were getting really close, but then not just close in terms of, a friendship, but close in terms of a spiritual connection, as, we felt like God was leading us individually. But it came to a point where when we met maybe halfway through, it was just very obvious that God was doing something, because when we were discussing what he was teaching us, I felt God was calling me to step into my role as a leader, in several ways, because I'm a very reticent leader. I don't actually like being in front. I don't like being on stage. I don't like being the, top dog. But I felt God was saying, okay, now is the time where you need to just accept it and grow in that capacity. And my wife was feeling at that time, you need to, learn how to utilize your particular gifting, and that the spouse that you should look for should be somebody who can, quote unquote, steer the ship. Which I actually said, and then she was like, "Okay, this is God." So
this gives hope to many young people, about becoming a friend with the opposite sex, and then becoming a partner for life.
That's the joke. It's all my friends like to say that I got out of the friend zone.
Oh, really? But hey, God prepared you.
Yeah, it was God. It was divine intervention.
Okay, well, it sounds wonderful. Now, leading from that to now being a fellow, where do you hope to go from, after actually finishing the fellowship at the UCLA?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the fellowship is a very new fellowship. There have only been 4 classes so far. And because it's so new, there aren't specific job careers description after the fellowship yet.
Okay.
A lot of the fellows who go into it initially thought that they would become what is called a chief medical information officer.
Oh, okay.
That is a position, like an executive level position, where they're kind of in charge of the technology aspect of the healthcare in the organization, things like the electronic record, making it better, optimizing it, data and reports and things like that. But it's not limited to that. There are many opportunities in private industry. We have a colleague who graduated a couple years ago who went to work for Google in the Google Health sector.
Oh, okay.
People who are working for private companies or startups like that to do an integration of healthcare and new technology. There are nonprofits and foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation who are using technology to decrease the disparities in healthcare across the world. And so they do things like educating other governments on how to collect, utilize technology, and then analyze data to decide on their healthcare policy.
Okay.
So things like that. There are many different iterations of it, but it's really up to the individual. And this is kind of where it is a cool time and cool space to be in this field, because it really is the sky is the limit. Your future in this field is only limited by your ability to dream, your capacity to envision the future.
Thank you, Dr. Lee, for speaking with us today. We will continue our discussions on our next episode. K-Pastors Roundtable is a discussion program for today's English-speaking Koreans and Christians. We will discuss the current issues and important issues dealing with our community. Your participation is very important to us. You can send in your questions or comments via email kprt316@gmail.com. You can hear our program on AM 1190 in Southern California on Saturday and Sunday at 1:30 p.m. You can also find us on YouTube channel K-Pastors Round Table. Please join us. Thank you.